So welcome. Today we're being joined by Brent, who's going to be giving a talk on aging in a social world. So Dr. Brent studies the evolution of sociality, and her work has focused mainly on rhesus monkeys, but she's also looked into other mammals like vampire bats, elephants, dairy cows, and killer whales. She did her bachelor's in McGill Universities and her master's at Calgary, and her PhD's from the University of Roehampton. And she's worked as a postdoctoral research fellow at Duke, and has been at Exeter, I think, since 2014.
Yeah, I always get that wrong too, but yeah.
Maybe. So, and where she is right now, and she's an associate professor there, and a member of the Center for Research and Animal Behavior. So welcome, Dr. Brent.
Thanks so much, Alexandra. Thanks for inviting me. It took us a long time to actually pull this off, so I'm happy it's actually
worked something out, even though unfortunately it's online. So.
I know. Yeah. Well, yeah, but you're just up the road, so hopefully I could come and visit sometime in the near future. I think because it took so long for us to put this together, my talk is actually a bit different in character from what I've originally said. So I'm actually not going to talk too explicitly about social aging, but definitely happy to, answer any questions about the work we're doing there. But hopefully you'll forgive me because I'm going to present a recent paper that we published. And so hopefully that's a bit more hot off the presses and will still be interesting to you and your career. But yeah, sorry, but if anyone's here who really only wants to hear about social aging, leave now. I won't be offended. So what I am, okay. Now I'm looking at how to share my screen on here. I have to remember which one's screen 1 and which one's screen 2. I think I got it.
Okay, we're seeing all your slides now.
Yeah, I haven't put it on presenter view yet. Is it on presenter view now?
No, it's just like the whole, like all the slides.
Ew. I mean, to be fair, I'm really terrible at doing this in Zoom also. You think we'd be completely useless. Okay, sorry, I'll stop presenting.
I struggle every time as well.
Right? Why isn't this easier? Okay. Maybe I'll start the presentation first before I try and share anything. That might help us out. It's thinking. Sorry. That should be it.
Okay, it looks good now.
Yeah, it's just the title slide. It's not the other
perfect.
version of PowerPoint.
Okay, so I'll let you take over from here then.
Okay, yeah, sorry about that. All right, so what I'm going to talk to you about today is really something that's quite important in my research and sort of one of my favorite questions if I have to pick one, which is the benefits of social connections. So it doesn't matter what kind of animal you are. If you live in a social group, we plot the patterning of your social connections to others. And when I talk about social connections, for today, I'm talking about affiliative or pro-social ties to others. If we plot those, your network basically ends up looking like this. And there are two things that really strike me about the structure of social networks in this respect, from an individual perspective. The first being, not everybody's partners with everybody else, right? There's not a line connecting all of these dots. There's partner choice in there. And secondly, not everybody is as well connected as everybody else, right? There's individual variation in the extent to which individuals are connected to their social worlds. And this is really important to psychology, to biology, because of course the structure that emerges, this map that you're looking at from those social connections, influences all sorts of things. It influences gene flow, disease transmission. The world we're living in right now speaks to that. Information flows through this shape. But also at the individual level, that variation might and does predict biological success. So quite simply, well-connected individuals live longer and have greater reproductive success. So in this cartoon network, if you're in the lucky position of being one of these yellow nodes in the network, you're well-connected. And if you're a person, that means that potentially your probability of dying young is lower than somebody who is less well-connected. And that hazard ratio has been shown in this plot here. So being socially isolated is what's plotted here in this yellow bar, appears to be worse in terms of survival outcomes for people than being a heavy smoker or being regularly exposed to air pollution, things we know are bad for us. But of course, I think of everything from an evolutionary perspective. And so that what really fascinates me is that this isn't just true in people, right? This has now been shown to be true in a wide range of mammals. So this plot here shows you the species in which a correlation between survival and social integration has been found. So if you're anything from a rock hyrax to a killer whale to a bighorn sheep to some other species of primate, we're seeing again and again this relationship between social integration and survival. And because in non-humans, we can look at things also like reproduction, because there aren't, there's no birth control typically, then it's also been found that another proxy for biological evolutionary success, which is reproductive output, also relates to social integration. So if you're a horse or a baboon, these are little marmots on the bottom, you're doing better in evolutionary terms if you're well connected compared to your other group mates who are less well so. So that's really fascinating, right? What does it suggest? It suggests, well, that all of these species, the thing they have in common is that they face some sort of challenge in their environments, and they solve that challenge by being well integrated in their societies. So there's some kind of evolved function to being well connected, right? But the outstanding question now is, and where this field has sort of turned its gaze, we're happy with this result. It seems to be quite consistent. Now the big outstanding question is, well, why? Why are social connections linked to fitness? What are they getting us that lead to these enhanced reproductive outcomes? So why are social connections linked to fitness? Answering this question forms really the foundation actually of a lot of the work that I do in my group. And I come at this from different angles. There are different ways to ask this question. And the first of which is really at the ultimate level. So really like put my evolutionary biologist hat on and say, ultimately what specific benefits do social connections provide individuals that allow them to live longer potentially or have more babies. Sometimes this seems really obvious, right? Like, so if you're a wolf and you are a cooperative hunter, you obviously need your social connections in order to hunt. But a lot of the times it seems less obvious. So if you're a non-human primate and you're integrated by grooming other individuals, why do you spend so much more time grooming others than you actually need to clean your skin and your fur? What is that kind of investment getting you above and beyond its hygienic function? And either way, there's very little empirical evidence. In the obvious case, the less obvious case, we have very little empirical evidence to really hang our hats on. Yet, this is the evolved function of social connections. This is where the link to fitness comes from. So that's at the ultimate level. We can secondly ask a bit more proximally or a bit more mechanistically, how are social connections getting under the skin to influence these fitness processes? So this is where I do ask questions about social aging. So if individuals who are less well integrated are aging faster at a molecular level, their bodies are degrading quickly outside of extrinsic mortality risk, right? Perhaps their immune function is declining faster. for example, than somebody who's less well integrated? Is this one biological mechanism by which we see the link between sociality and fitness really being played out in our physiology? And then finally, I like to ask questions about, well, there's also a puzzle embedded here, because if it pays to be well connected, why isn't everybody well connected? Why isn't everybody really integrated into their societies? What genetic or environmental, including social environmental factors, act on individuals that might sometimes constrain them from obtaining the social capital, the social support that they need in order to thrive and do well? So as I said, my work touches on all three of these. Today, we're going to leave actually to one side the biological aspect of this and really focus in on asking questions about the ultimate function of social connections, and touch on individual variation in those connections and how that comes about. So we're going to start here and ask about these benefits. Now, the first thing that really struck me when thinking about this question is that there are lots of ways to be well connected, right? This kind of gets borne out in this sort of human social interaction and relationship literature, but it also really is quite obvious if you do anything with social network analysis as a tool, because this whole tool, its whole purpose is to provide us with measures of social connections, right? And there are lots of different measures. So there are lots of ways to be well connected, but which ones are the best in terms of biological success? And then what does that tell us about the function of those connections? I'm going to walk you through what I mean here. But first, what are some of the main ways that we can be connected to our networks? First and foremost, we can form really strong, stable relationships with particular others, right? So we can have best friends, if you like. Secondly, we can be a little bit more like a social butterfly, right? We can interact a lot with others, but the identity of those others doesn't matter so much in this paradigm. So you're just, integrated. And finally, we can be well connected through our connections to others. So through your connection to your close social partner, if they have lots of friends and you have lots of friends, and you're connected to the wider network through them. We can call these things more pithy names to remember them better. So the first one I'm going to call strong dyadic connections. The next one I'm going to call indiscriminate integration, to reflect the fact that here your partner doesn't matter, their identity doesn't matter so much. And finally, I'm going to call this indirect connections, which is what it's called in the network analysis kind of lexicon. So parsing these different ways to be connected, as I suggested, I think has value in terms of pointing us towards the direction of what the function of these connections are. Because if you're to find a relationship between fitness and one of these measures, but not another, you might infer that the function of social relationships is one thing and not the other. What do I mean by that? I mean that if you're to find a relationship between strong dyadic connections, for example, then you might infer quite generally, but nonetheless infer that being well connected is about coordinating your actions or about cooperation, right? Because apparently what you need are reliable, predictable partners where you understand something about their needs, they understand something about your needs, and you've invested in them and they've reciprocally invested in you, right? So strong dyadic connections most likely are about cooperation, coordinated behavior. Indiscriminate integration, where the identity of your partner is less important, is probably about tolerance. So if we're to find a relationship between fitness and indiscriminate integration, we might infer that what is going on is that what you need from your connections is to be tolerated in your environment, to be able to move around, to access the resources that you need with little threat of reprisal, of aggression. You can move about your world kind of freely. And then finally, quite classically, indirect connections are often talked about as kind of the transmission types of connections. So if we find a relationship between fitness and indirect connections, we may infer that being connected is about obtaining information from your world. And the best way to do that is to be indirectly connected. So what do we know so far about the different types of connections more specifically and their relationship with fitness? If we go back to this nice summary table and summarizes all the results in mammals to date, we can look at the types of connections that they've found fitness correlates for. So some of them have looked at strong dyadic connections and have found, yep, this is what in this system is important for survival. Others have looked at indiscriminate integration, and some have taken kind of a real network analysis approach and as a consequence have both measures of indiscriminate integration and these indirect connections. But the key here is that basically all of these studies have really only looked at the measure that I've shown you, right? So studies that have looked at indiscriminate integration haven't also considered strong social ties, strong dyadic social ties. And that can be an issue because, of course, these things sometimes emerge from their emergent properties of the same interactions between individuals, so they can be real confounds to each other. So if you look at one and not the other, you can conclude in general social connections have a relationship to your fitness proxy, but you can't really say, yep, it's this one and not the other, unless you measure both. So that's what we set out to do. We set out to ask what types of social connections are linked to fitness and to look at a large number of ways to be connected in doing so. This is, of course, the intended outcome of revealing information about the ultimate function or functions of social connections. Because, of course, I don't believe there can be just one. I think there can be many. So we're going to allow that to happen. So like most of my work, we were asking this question at my long-term fields station, which is called Cayo Santiago, which is an island off the coast of Puerto Rico. You see there in the bottom of the screen, a kind of picture of it from the side. But I'm going to show you a little video of Cayo. So this is a small island off the eastern coast of Puerto Rico in the Caribbean. This is an aerial shot of Cayo. So it's a really like lush green place that we get to by boat. And it's basically full of monkeys. So this is what we call a free roaming site. The animals, there are about 1,600 individual rhesus macaques. They self-organize into groups at any point in time. There are between 6 and 9 social groups on the island. The groups are, as all macaque groups are, regardless of macaque species, multi-male, multi-female. Females remain in the group for life, whereas males disperse at sexual maturity. And they are highly social animals, which makes them a pretty good study system if you're interested in the evolution of social relationships. So they spend vast amounts of their time engaged in affiliation. They'll spend, for example, up to 20% of their day grooming other individuals or being groomed by them, which is a fairly relatively large number for any primate. But the flip side of that, as you see on the screen at the moment, is this is also a highly competitive society. In the picture, you're seeing one group being aggressive towards another group, but there are huge levels of intra-group competition. So they have very strict, steep dominance hierarchies, where individuals at the top of the hierarchy have greater access to resources than individuals at the bottom. And they're also quite nepotistic. So amongst the females anyway, there's a certain level of preference for family members. The other fantastic thing about Cayo Santiago, and the reason I do a lot of my work on social processes there, is that this is one of the longest running field sites of any vertebrate in the world. So it was established in 1938 by a scientist called Charles Ray Carpenter, who went and took rhesus macaques from India, which is their natural home range, put 400 on a boat, drove them to Puerto Rico, and placed them on Cayo Santiago with the idea that what he wanted was, he was an American and he wanted to have a field site to study the natural behavior of a non-human primate closer to home. So he recorded this video. The descendants, the monkeys alive on Cayo today, are all descendants of those 409 in original founding macaques. And what that means is that we know a lot about these individuals. So the Caribbean Primate Research Center that manages the site maintains a maternal pedigree that dates back to the 1950s and a genetic pedigree that includes both mother and father of everybody alive on the island dating back to 1992. Which means we know with exceptional detail things about the demography of these individuals, their family size, how much reproduction they've got up to, and of course we know their dates of birth and death within a few days in most cases. So really fantastic system, highly social. We have information about fitness proxies to merge those two things together. So the long-term data are basically provided to any researcher who goes and works on Cayo Santiago. I don't own this field site at all. I basically pay to play. I pay to go and work there. And with that comes the pedigree information, the survival information. But on top of that, you have to add your own data to answer the scientific questions that you're interested in. So my data are, of course, social network data. Here's one of my long-term research assistants, Josue Negron, collecting typically what we do to get our data, which is a focal animal sample. So Josue works in a study group. He recognizes all the animals in that group on site, basically, from their facial features, similar to how you recognize other people. And right now, he's doing a focal animal follow on this adult female whose text is in white, that's called 63B. And he's recording basically everything she does and everybody she does that with. So right now, is she interacting with anyone? No. What is she doing? Well, she's picking through the dirt and eating it to get some micronutrients. But there's a male sitting nearby, a male called 43P. On that proximity information, so which adults are sitting near a focal subject, is something that we're really interested in terms of building our social networks, as is this behavior that I've already mentioned, which is grooming behavior, which is the kind of foundational way that non-human primates form social relationships with one another. So Josue repeats this process for all adults in the group where he works over time. And at the end of a year, we summarize all that data and we use it to build a social network. So here's a section of the data that we've amassed on Cayo to date. What you're looking at are social networks across different groups and years. So groups are color-coded. So we've been studying this group called Group F from 2010, and here we've plotted its networks up to 2015. And then these are some other social groups on the island where we've also got a year or maybe a few years of data on the animals' levels of social integration. So we're going to use these networks to ask our question. What ways of being well connected are associated with survival in this system? So the first thing we need to do is we need to decide how are we going to measure these concepts that I set out. So what I'm going to show you now are a series of little network cartoons to explain these measures in a bit more detail. A cartoon is always going to look like this. Our subject is the big circle in the middle, the big node in the middle. And the lines connecting them to other individuals in their network are either solid, and they vary in width based on how often those individuals interact with each other. And if they're solid, those edges in the network are something that I use to compute the measure that I'm interested in. And if they're dashed, then those connections exist, but I'm not using them to tell you anything about how connected the central node is to their network. So let's go through now. Hopefully, if that doesn't make sense, hopefully it will once you start to see a few examples. So we've got three ways of measuring each of these three concepts. So you're going to see 9 different network plots. So the first way that we wanted to measure strong dyadic connections was to count the number of strong partners that our monkeys had. So how did we define strong? Well, we set a threshold. In this example network, we set the threshold to equal 1. So if your edge was 1 or bigger, as these 3 are, then it was going to get counted towards being a strong connection. So this individual has 3 strong connections. And we varied that threshold to be at different levels. We didn't want to pick it a priority, so we actually have multiple thresholds of strong connections that we evaluate. Next, we wanted to ask, okay, well, the number of strong partners you have might be important, but also how often you engage in interactions with them might be important. So here, we set the threshold to be how many partners are we considering strong? So here you can have as many as 3 top partners, and then we tally up how often you interact with them. So we tally up these numbers. 1 + 2 + 3 gives you a value of 6. Finally, what's quite common when people are interested in these strong bonds, as they're often called, is stability. So we also wanted to look whether individuals were reappearing in the top partnership of our focal subject over time. So in year T-1, are you strong partners? Are you, again, strong partners in year T? And how often is our focal subject interacting with those stable, strong partners? So then indiscriminate integration, you'll remember here the identity of your partner matters much less. So what we're interested in is just quite basically things like the strength of your connections, which is sort of a network jargony term. What I really mean is simply how often are you interacting with others. So all of the individuals our focal subject interacts with directly, I've just tallied up the strength of that edge. But similarly, we might care about how many individuals you're interacting with. So you've got 4 partners if you're this individual. They're not particularly strong partners, but you have 4 in total. And finally, kind of the inverse of having a strong partner, you might have what's called weak connections. And this was really born out of the sociological literature that has posited for many years that having weak connections serves certain societal benefits for individuals. So just like with strong connections, we set the threshold of what is weak. So now we're talking about having a really minimal edge. And we tallied up how many weak connections our subjects had. And again, we varied the threshold of what we consider weak. Then finally, we have measures of indirect connectedness. They have funny names, and these are because they're real network measures that this is what they're called. This is what these algorithms produce. So there's something that's called betweenness. If you haven't come across it before, it's basically a measure of brokerage. If I have high betweenness in my network, I sit in a position that connects parts of the network that wouldn't otherwise be connected. So I'm the broker between those 2 separate parts of the network. Closeness is similar. You kind of count the number of paths it takes to connect everybody from the central individual. And then eigenvector centrality is the weirdest name of all, I think, but this is really just like a popularity score. So do you have connections who are themselves well connected to the network? So, you know, the cool kids have friends who are also cool, basically, in real human terms. So those are our indirect measures. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you our results. We take all of these 9 measures and we line them up with survival outcomes. In the female rhesus macaques, it's much easier to do this in the females because they stay in their groups for life, whereas the males are moving around. So we're only going to look at females. But we have about more than 300 females that fed into this data set. So you see you've got still the same 9 boxes that you had before with an added box on the end, just so I can show you some little survival plots, just because those are visually nice to look at. Here are networks. Those edges in the networks include both grooming and sitting near each other, so proximity, like I mentioned before. Anything that's a significant predictor of survival, you're going to see a solid line. Anything that's not significantly predicting survival is going to be a dashed line in this plot. So we're going to look at strong connections first and our 3 measures of strong connections. Do any of these predict survival? You can see along the bottom, this is us varying our thresholds, these numbers you see here, so thresholds for how strong is strong. And what we found is that individuals with strong connections to their top 3 partners better survival outcomes than individuals that had weaker connections to those partners. That's what I've plotted in the In the far right side in the survival plot, the darker line are individuals with really strong, who spend a lot of time with their top partner, compared to individuals who don't spend very much time with their top partner. And then secondly, stability was important. These are different ways of measuring stability. Don't worry about it too much, but one of these measures of having stable relationships to those top dyadic partners was a significant predictor of survival. What about indiscriminate integration? If we look across our 3 different ways of measuring this, we find that most of our measures of weak connectedness, most thresholds of having weak connections, significantly predicted survival. That's again what I've plotted over there. So individuals, when the threshold for weak is set at 50% of your connections, then individuals who have a large number of weak connections are living longer than individuals that have a smaller number. Okay. There's a circle around those results. And then finally, being indirectly connected didn't appear to be correlated with survival in this setup. A couple of things to point out. Firstly, what we were looking at was annual survival, so not how long you're living, but your probability of living to the next year. So this allows us to look within an individual female. Her given level of sociality in a year, is that predicting whether she lives to the next year, which allows us to at least quasi-control for certain directionalities, because it's within an individual. You know, her genes are the same year to year, so it's not something about her quality differing from other individuals. We're really comparing herself to herself. And secondly, to point out that these results maybe aren't that surprising, because they do really gel with what's been shown, at least in other non-human primates, and particularly other old world monkeys, where your connections to your top 3 partners has been examined in baboons and has been found to be a predictor of survival. Same with your number of weak connections in baboons, in blue monkeys. The stability too. So although those studies only looked at 1 or a couple of measures, when we throw everything in the kitchen sink at it, actually the same results are falling out, which is pretty cool, I think, and gives us further, I think, confidence that at least in old world monkeys, this perhaps is what's going on, which is that well-connected monkeys are living longer than more poorly connected monkeys. In the rhesus macaques, that's 11% higher probability of survival from 1 year to the next, so not over the lifetime, but each year, 11% higher probability. And what does that potentially tell us about the function of these relationships, right? Our big question at the outset. Well, that there are 2 routes to success, potentially. First of all, connections might achieve fitness through cooperation, through coordination with those strong partners. So you're this female, maybe one of your close social partners is going to come and help you to get rid of this male who's attacking you. But social connections might also achieve fitness via tolerance. So being connected to others indiscriminately might allow you to move around your environment and access resources more easily. Important to note that females that were high on having strong, stable social bonds were not the same females as those that were indiscriminately integrated. So these appear to potentially be separate strategies. You're either doing one, you're a social butterfly, or you're doing the other. You have a small, tight-knit network of close buddies. Which brings us then to this question. Whenever I talk about individual variation leading to potentially to fitness consequences, I'm always struck with, okay, well, then why do we have this individual variation? What I mean by that is, well, if it pays to be well connected, why isn't everybody really well integrated into their societies? Because that would make sense, right? If this is something that has fitness benefits being selected for, why isn't everybody achieving those levels? What factors are constraining individuals or simply predicting whether you're integrated or not? So we have looked at this kind of over the years in various ways, at least in the rhesus macaque system. So if we go back to a network plot, this is a grooming network in rhesus macaques, and we've got males and females represented here, where males are squares and females are circles. High-ranking individuals are the darker colors, so the darker blue, and low-ranking ones are the lighter blue. And there's a directionality to grooming, right? So you'll see some arrows on these plots, and it's simply the individual receiving the grooming. The arrow points towards them, and their partner is the one from which the arrow originates. So if we take all of our data, I think in total there's more than 500 monkeys now that we've included the males, and we ask questions about, well, what are some factors that drive this variation? We've previously shown, using the long-term pedigree, you can run really nice animal models that allows you to estimate heritability. So we've previously shown that being socially integrated, or the flip side, being socially isolated, is a little bit genetically determined. So heritability is on the order of 15–20%. And with that, these kind of go hand in hand. It's also a bit repeatable over time. So if you follow an individual over time, how connected they are in 1 year predicts a little bit how connected they are in the next year. But most of the variation is what I'm going to call, and this is really like a quantitative genetics way of thinking about it, environmental. And environmental basically includes most things, everything that isn't genetic, including things like sex. So I think if you get your eye into reading these network plots, I think you'll see straight away from this example one that males are more connected than females, right? More circles are sort of in the sort of central mix with lots of ties going into them than males. That's quite consistent. High status individuals are better connected than low status individuals. Females that have a greater number of adult relatives in the group, so if their mom is around, if they have lots of adult daughters, if they have lots of sisters, are better connected than females that don't have many kin, which relates to their nepotism and their bias towards kin-based relationships. And we're starting to show, and maybe next time I come and visit you, I can tell you in more detail about these results that are really kind of like growing in our group, that older individuals are less connected than younger individuals. In particular, we're starting to get evidence that these are changes that happen within an individual over time. So it's not just that the cohort of older animals, the ones that made it to old age, happen to be individuals that were always socially isolated, and they just end up representing old individuals in time, but actually that we're witnessing changes across the lifespan of these individuals, that as they age, they're becoming less integrated. So what does this tell us? If most of the variation is environmental, it suggests what we're looking at is quite a dynamic system, right? So the attributes individuals have, the context that they find themselves in, shift over the lifespan, not just including age, but also including age. And these might be shifts that occur in part in response to different resource pressures, right? Different challenges faced by these animals within their lifespan. So what might some of those challenges be? And then to kind of flip it back to the original question, then what are those shifts, those dynamics tell us about, again, the function of being connected? So I want to close then by telling you about that recent paper that we published about a month ago, which relates to actually an extreme environmental disturbance. So how are animals responding as individuals and in terms of their social connections to an extreme event? So a real shock to the system and a real moment for us to say just how dynamic are social connections in these animals. So in 2017, in September, Hurricane Maria, which is a Category 4 hurricane, hit the eastern coast of Puerto Rico. This is the worst hurricane on record in Puerto Rico. Thousands of people died. Power was cut across the island for many months. On the east coast, where Cayo Santiago is located, there was no electricity for 9 months. And in the little inset, you see a tiny star, and next to that star, a tiny little speck. That is Cayo Santiago Island. The gray blob is the eye of the storm, and the green edge is the eye wall, which is the worst place to be in a hurricane. The eye is fairly stable in terms of wind direction. The eye wall, of course, the wind is spinning. very rapidly. Here we're talking 400 plus kilometers rapidly. So Maria made landfall basically on top of Cayo Santiago. So just to remind you of what it looked like before, so there was a beautiful mangrove and a palm grove, and then most of the island was connected by a quite closed canopy. There was some research infrastructure, so the hexagonal thing you see there is where the monkeys get fed every day, and some places where we stored research equipment, eat our lunch, park the truck, etc. And this is what it looked like about 5 days afterwards. So we weren't sure that any monkeys had survived at all. So we sent the scientific director, Angie Ruiz, up in a helicopter. She was able to fly over and record this footage. You can see all the trees felled there. The scientific infrastructure was basically, all the buildings were basically collapsed. But she did see monkeys. So hope was low, but not lost at this point. Basically, what happened from a monkey's eye view is that their world went from looking like something like this to more like looking like something like this. And we can plot how much devastation happened on the island. So using satellite images, we have what's called a greenness index. The dashed line is when Maria hit, and you see a massive drop off in greenness that really, we've plotted this up till 2020, really hasn't got better, if you like. So greenness is still low. Shade, therefore, is in short supply for these individuals. On average, it's 8 degrees hotter. So the animal's ability to thermoregulate, although like us, they thermoregulate, but still when it's hot, it's unpleasant. Things get difficult for us. But they're fed, and they were always fed. And so food isn't so much of an issue, which we think is what relates to their actually really very incredible low mortality rates in the face of this storm. So here we've plotted deaths per 100 adults going back to 1998. Those are all the gray lines that you see. Maria hit where the red line is, and this is, the orange line is deaths in 2017. There's a little spike, a significant spike in October 2017. About 20 adults died, mostly old ones. And then the yellow line is 2018 to demonstrate that mortality, even though shade has not returned, vegetation has not returned, mortality has gone back to basically what it was normally. So there's an absence of mass mortality, which actually in terms of social connections means that we're not dealing with a huge upheaval of loss of potential partners, but if there is any rewiring of the social networks, that's due to responding to shifts in ecology rather than demographic change. So what we want to do then is to take the example of this hurricane and ask the following questions. Did a natural disaster alter the social connections of these animals? Was there individual variation in the resilience or ability to respond to this event in terms of being connected? And what does this reveal then about the function of social connections? And we made a really simple prediction that rhesus macaques will become more social after the natural disaster, which would be consistent with the social buffering hypothesis, which is basically what I've been talking about to date, that there is simply, when faced with a challenge or adversity, your social connections help you get through that. So we happen to be following 2 social groups before Maria hit. So we have a few years of data, up to 3 years of data on these groups prior to the end of 2017. And then we're going to compare that to what their connections looked like in 2018. So these are called Group V and Group KK. So all the plots you're going to see will have both groups represented. So did macaques become more affiliated after the storm? The analyses were all conducted by a PhD student who I co-supervise, Camille Testard, who is at the University of Pennsylvania. And what we found is that both in terms of proximity, so spending time near others, and grooming, that after Maria, so post there on the bottom of the plots, went up 400-fold, so 400 increase in probability of an individual being seen in proximity to others, and a 50% uptick in your probability of grooming. Not everybody changed to the same extent, though. So this histogram shows you individuals who were grooming more. On average, they all were. However, some individuals actually ended up grooming less after the storm. And COMPME examined what might predict those individual differences and found that actually individuals that weren't very well integrated, that's the plot up in the upper right-hand corner, that they changed the most. So individuals that weren't very integrated amped up their social lives more than individuals that were well integrated before the storm. And also individuals that spent a lot of time in proximity to others changed also. However, losing a social partner, we actually looked at this in the rare cases where an individual lost a close social partner. It actually they didn't respond by reaching out to others to replace that partner. So here we think it suggests that the individuals that needed to change the most were the ones that were most socially isolated before the storm, and they were able to do so. They were able to become more integrated. Next, we wanted to look at, well, what are these monkeys doing? So they're spending more time being social, but there are two options. You can spend more time with those close social partners, or you can have more friends, right? You can become more indiscriminately integrated. What might that look like in network terms? Well, if you spend more time with your best partners, your edges are getting fatter. If you have more friends and you just have a denser network, there are more edges. And that's the second option is exactly what we found. So this is a pre-hurricane network example from 2017 on the left, and then from after the hurricane on the right. There were just much more edges. Monkeys weren't strengthening their relationships with familiar or previous partners. What they were doing is they were making more connections. So they're not spending more time with their best buddies, they're making more friends. Why might they be doing this? Remember, shade has become a scarce resource. So after Maria, this kind of comical scene of monkeys on a log, but on the shade relief of a log, were really common, right? So they were lining up in the tiny patch of shade available to them. What does that mean? Well, if you think of entering a really crowded bar, right? If your friends are sat at a table, your close friends are sat at a table, they might not have a seat for you. But if you know lots of people in the bar, if you have lots of weak connections or acquaintances in the bar, you're much more likely to get a place to sit down, right? So indiscriminate social integration, we think in the context of this storm and its continuing aftermath, has actually won out. Before we saw that having close social ties and being indiscriminately connected were beneficial in this system. Now it appears to be that perhaps we have a dominant strategy emerging, which is to be indiscriminately integrated. We're now following that up to ask, well, does this impact fitness or individuals who changed in this way in particular, now the ones really doing better? But that's going to take a while because, of course, we need for those survival or reproductive outcomes to occur, and that takes time. So just to sum up, then, what can we conclude? Well, generally that it pays to be socially connected, but in particular, what social connections might be doing is enhancing coordinated behaviors, conferring tolerance in a manner that helps you attain resources, whether that's food or whether that's something like shade. And the benefits of social connections exist, but they're mutable, they're context dependent. And that context might be how old you are, it might be your sex, it might be how you respond to a major disaster. So I realize I'm a bit pushed on time, so I'll just end it there. But we'll do so by saying thanks again to Alexandra for inviting me, and thanks to all this work is done, of course, quite collaboratively with members of my research group, but also with the University of Puerto Rico and collaborators, other collaborators in the United States. And thank you all for coming this morning, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much for such a fascinating talk. I'll just see if anybody wants to chime in with questions. Otherwise, we have a few written down as well.
Oh, you do?
Yeah. Anybody want to speak up, or shall I start reading?
When you start reading, we'll get the flow going. And then,
So Charles Mugoya asks, is there any particular reason why males are more connected than females are? Perhaps males have a much more simple criteria when forming groups.
So males are less connected than females. Sometimes I say that inversely, but males are less connected than females. And that's fairly typical, not just in rhesus macaques, but in old world monkeys in general. And
in the figure, the males were the squares, right?
The males were the squares.
Yeah, I think maybe that got a bit confused.
I often mix that up. The males were the squares. The males were the ones that more often than females were off floating on their own, meaning that we didn't see them interact with anybody across a whole year, right? That's fairly extreme if you're a highly social primate. Yeah, but there are pretty good reasons for that, we think, and I think it links to dispersal, right? So these males move into a social group when they reach sexual maturity. They don't have any relatives. They aren't familiar with anyone. And so they're partly starting off from scratch in terms of building social relationships. And they might not stay in that group for very long. They might only stay there for 2 years or so and then move into another group and start the whole process over again. But I think it does speak to potentially there being sex differences in social connections and how they might help the different sexes face the challenges that they face, which differ. And I think potentially it's difficult, as I said, to look at this in males. But I think potentially what people will find, what they have found in the past is that male social connections, when they're associated with fitness, is that potentially this is about coalitions, so small groups of males forming cooperative alliances in order to topple somebody high-ranking, for example, or to gain a mating opportunity. That's very different in a way from what females might do with their social connections. So I think as people look at it, they're going to continue to find either that pattern or just simply a weaker link between social connections, at least as we've typically looked at them in females, in the males. And there's lots of really cool work going on in human social psychology that's starting to ask questions about, in humans, how male and female social relationships are born out, how we think about them. And we tend to think about, I think the punchline is we tend to think about them as being more different than they actually end up actually being, right? We think that there are huge differences, but actually two people, male and female relationships, feel the same, hold similar weight to the people, even though phenotypically they might look a bit different.
Do the females and males have similar lifespans at all?
Just like us, females live a bit longer.
So again, it's a correlate with the connectivity of the female relationships, maybe?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. So female average lifespan, if you're an adult, your average lifespan as a female is 18 years, and as a male, it's 15.
We have a few more questions, so I'm gonna go on to the next one. So Phoebe Burton asks, why do you think that a large number of weak dyadic connections help survival more, so then merely a small number of strong dyadic connections, especially when people often refer to a few close friends as being more beneficial in humans?
Right. Yeah. So I think this is exactly where I think that there's huge amounts of work to be done. So I think having a few close friends in humans sometimes is beneficial, but the social butterfly phenotype is also a real phenotype in people too. I'm a close small circle kind of person, but I do know plenty of people who are social butterflies, right? And potentially in some contexts that is actually the better option, whether you're a human or whether you're a rhesus macaque. And the way it's been talked about in the human sociological literature, the benefits of weak ties, is in part about gaining opportunities, social opportunities. You gain those through acquaintances, through somebody, at work introducing you to somebody else, and that ends up being your future spouse, right? Or they end up offering you a job. So there are ways that these weak connections can bear fruit in terms of benefits. When you're a human, when you're a non-human, I think it's sort of similar. It's about accessing things in your environment and being able to do that, because you've got tolerance from these individuals. They might not invest a huge amount of time with you. They might not come to your aid when you get in a fight, but they're okay if you sit next to them when you're eating, right? And that's important. Or they're okay sitting next to you in a shady spot, and you might need that. So I think it's not either or. I think it's both.
Okay.
Yeah.
that makes sense. So Gemma Watkins asks, you mentioned about tolerance and holding strong connections for betterment. What suggestions do you have in particular with indirect connections that may require boundaries to maintain personal well-being? So effectively, how can one be tolerant and maintain strong connections and yet maintain boundaries?
Let me think about this. I'm not sure I know what you mean by boundaries, Gemma. I think this is where a lot of this work is going in terms of what does our social ecosystem look like overall? Like if there's an average human social ecosystem, what is that? But where are there differences? So again, if I'm a strong best friend kind of person, does that preclude me from also having a lot of weak ties? Potentially. Potentially it does, because I'm investing all my time in those dyadic connections, and I don't actually have time to, grab coffee with someone who I see once a year. I just actually don't have time.
Does having dyadic connections actually take away time from the other connections?
Maybe. This is something that we really need to figure out, whether you're a human, whether you're a rhesus macaque. So in our system, it seems to females who do one way aren't the females who do the other way. So that might suggest that they're just time limited, right? That they've got a time budget, they do their social strategy, and it precludes them from doing something else. Interestingly, I know of some work that's being done on chimpanzees that shows that you can do both if you're I'm pretty sure male chimpanzee. But this is all stuff that's like new and kind of the new direction of social relationships. It's really to start like drawing circles around what are the types of social relationships, and what do our individual kind of ego networks or ecosystems look like? And is that something that's stable? Is that something that is inflexible? Can you really only invest in one way? It's really like something that is up and coming in this area, and I think we'll know a lot more about in kind of 5 years' time.
Thank you. I think we only have time for one more question, but this one is really interesting. Alison Wadley, has this sort of research had any applications to the current pandemic, the hurricane, how lonelier people might have become more connected in a crisis?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I had a lot because we got a bit of press coverage from the hurricane paper, and a lot of journalists wanted me to answer this question too. So I've thought a little bit about it, and I think the main positive thing we can take from the results in the rhesus macaques is that idea that we are flexible, that the benefits of social connections are context dependent, and although maybe we're not feeling so great a year and a few months into lots of lockdowns and social isolation because we're a social species, at this moment in time, most likely what's happening is if we were able to quantify on a grand scale the costs and benefits of social connections. Right now, the costs are pretty high, right? And so the probably best thing is to be more isolated. And if you're the kind of individual who is more isolated to start with, you might be coping with that a bit better because you weren't using social connections to solve problems as much as others. So you might be doing a bit better. But I think on average, everyone long-term outcome, even if it feels bad in the moment, is doing better by having shifted to being more socially isolated. So if that's I don't know if that's so much of a positive takeaway. I think it sort of is, right? There's flexibility built into our systems, whether you're a monkey, whether you're a human, we can change a little bit when we need to. It's not to say, and I think we'll change back once, the risk is gone and the benefits of social connections go back to outweighing the costs, which is what we're used to.
That's a really interesting perspective. Yeah. So I think that's all we have time for today. We're running a bit over already, but it was so wonderful to hear, especially about your new research as well. It was just fascinating. So thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks again for inviting me. And yeah, really happy we finally pulled this off.
Yeah, really, really exciting stuff. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.